Welcome to Interstellar Cosmic Conversations, where we share experiences from our hearts to empower others. Hello, James. Welcome back to Interstellar Cosmic Conversations. It is awesome to have you back. Last time you were with us, you shared your experiences from your childhood up into your adulthood and what got you interested in, I guess, what we would call the paranormal, the supernatural, but really it's all very natural. Welcome back, and it's good to have you here.
Likewise, Patricia. Thank you so much for having me back on. I really enjoy these discussions we have.
Thank you, and I do too. What James is going to be talking about today is all of the different types of interdimensional beings that he's familiar with, what their roles are, where they're from, how they affect us here on our planet and within the universe. So I'm just going to let James have the floor. I'm going to do my best not to say too much today and let him share, unless I feel like there's a question that might come up where we might need more information on it, or if I just feel like it's necessary for me to share an experience that I've had. So James, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Patricia.
You're welcome.
I'd like to talk about some of the beings that I'm familiar with, and these beings basically are parts of civilizations, of societies, of distinct species, and sometimes they seem to work with one another in an alliance or something of that nature. And the ones I want to talk about initially, because I'm most familiar with them, are the reptilians and the Mantis beings and the greys. The reptilians, the Mantis beings, and the greys for a long time have had an advantage over human beings because of their ability to alter their density, the ability to operate simultaneously in more than one dimension, more than one realm, if you will. We humans have had this capability, but over time and through a lot of genetic manipulation, and then all these other things that were layered on top of that, the processed food and everything else, and the pushback away from nature, basically, what's happened is we've gotten too dense, we've densified. And so a lot of these beings for a long time have had the tactical high ground, the ability to manipulate us in all states of consciousness, especially the dream state and the sleeping state, because we spend so much, well, at least some people, not so much me, some people spend a lot of their time sleeping, right? And so when they're in the sleep state, unless they have a naturally high vibration, unless they leave tools laying around, tensor devices, orgone generators, Himalayan salt lamps, etc., that may offer some degree of protection, what happens is they're left wide open. And because these beings have the ability to alter their density to make themselves operate in more than one dimension at a time, they're able to manipulate us. And let me give you an example of what some of the reptilians can do. The reptilians, as many people have heard me say before, they're masters of frequency and resonance. They can alter their density. And so what happens is, in our example, a person who's sleeping, the reptilian, they may be onto this person due to their family bloodline, due to a sympathetic resonance with their genetics. Maybe this person, through no fault of their own, in many cases, may have enough reptilian DNA that enables these entities to interface with them, to interlink with them, if you will. So what happens is, while the person is laying asleep, these reptilians can alter their density, and then they can basically pass into the sleeping person and take over their dreamscape from within. And they can simultaneously, in parallel fashion to the astral dreamscape stage managed dream manipulation, depending on the agenda, let's say in our example, they want to do sexual manipulation, sexual programming, they can activate the sexual arousal mechanism of the individual, male or female, and also create the stage managed dream that is very highly eroticized, right? And when the person comes to an awareness within this, what essentially is a virtual environment, it's essentially a virtual stage managed dream, astral dreamscape environment, they will find that it is a highly sexually charged environment, atmosphere, if you will. They will find that they are really turned on, sexually aroused, and then these entities, because they create this internal landscape, this mental landscape, and they compel the person to have to operate within this artificial environment, they can present all kinds of visual stimuli in the form of, desirable women or what seem to be desirable women, and they can take in any number of directions. If they want to make the person develop a predilection for children, if they want the person to become a child molester, for example, they may amp up the sexual arousal of the person. And remember, the person's just laying there for all intents and purposes, all outward appearances, they're laying there sleeping, right? But all this is going on within the context of their astral dreamscape. So, and people have heard me talk about this before, but it bears repeating. In this stage managed dream scenario, they may think that they're about to engage in intercourse with what they perceive to be a highly sexually desirable woman. Their arousal mechanism is activated. The very air around them, if you will, the very atmosphere around them is highly charged sexually. That's because this entity has come in to the sleeping person, altered its density, comfortably slipped into the person, and taken over their dream from within. And just as a person begins to have intercourse with this woman, the woman in our example, this stage managed female, a stage managed dream female, may adopt a very seductive pose or an inviting pose, if you will, on a sofa, on a bed, whatever the case may be, even on the floor. And he's just thinking, well, I don't know if there's a dream, I don't know what, but, I'm really turned on, et cetera, et cetera. And then he may go through the process of initiating intercourse with what he perceives to be a highly desirable woman, and then whammo, the highly desirable woman morphs into something repugnant, like a young child, even one's own child, one's own son, one's own daughter, a nephew, whatever the case may be, a neighbor kid. And just as they begin the process of intercourse, they get sodomized from behind, and then the object of their desires morphs into something completely repellent, completely repugnant. And then they can, vary it depending on what they're trying to get out, what the agenda of the sexual programming, behavior programming agenda is. If this process continues, and the person really doesn't have a context to understand it. Gee, that was a crazy dream, and their backside might hurt, but they don't really have a context to understand it, right? And then they fall for it again, say the next night or the night after, a couple of nights later. This time, instead of the object of his desires in his astral dreamscape stage managed dream, which the reptilians, remember, are perpetrating, are creating. This time, instead of the object of his desires, this woman morphing into a young child, his own child, a neighbor child, now it morphs into some kind of hermaphroditic he, she, right? And he's still, remember, he's still in a highly charged, highly sexually aroused state, because it's a parallel astral dreamscape stage managed manipulation within the mind, the third eye vision of this sleeping individual. They've created this whole astral virtual environment, but parallel to that, they have activated the arousal mechanism, made the person, in our example, extremely sexually aroused. So that's just one example. But if they want to, let's say, induce impulsiveness, aggression, violent tendencies within the person, then they will tweak the astral dreamscape the stage managed dream accordingly. They will put this individual in such scenarios in these virtual dream environments where he's always being attacked, he's always being set upon by crowds, he's always having to lash out, always having to fight. He's put in a state of flight or fight constantly. And also it should be pointed out that what appear to be human mind controllers can do the same thing, but I would argue, and I have argued, that there really isn't such a thing as a purely human mind control project, because those perps in these human mind control projects that are tweaking the knobs, the psychologists, what have you, they themselves are entity infested. They themselves are hosts for some of these entities. So when people split hairs and say, oh, this is all just human manipulation, they really don't understand, have the depth of understanding of the true nature of the depth of this non-human archontic manipulation. And we can see how this can play out on a societal level, and how in my most recent commentaries, I talked about the cultural Marxism, the hypersexualization of children, the promotion of pedophilia in the classrooms, beginning at kindergarten, mind you folks, of so-called safe schools, an oxymoron if there ever was one. When you track back and see who was behind the formation, the initial group starting up the safe schools, they're all a bunch of academic pedophiles who proudly wrote papers and so-called research papers promoting pedophilia, saying that it's just an orientation. And now, because of the cultural Marxism habit of promoting victimization in all these different demographic elements throughout society, everyone's a victim now, right? And instead of going after the source of all their problems, the corporations and the intelligence and security services that back the corporations, that do the corporations' bidding, instead of the think tanks and the universities and academic elements which promote all this. Oh no, they're going after the person on the street who happens to have a haircut that looks like a Nazi haircut, whatever that is, or they're meeting out their frustrations on statues or whatever the case may be. We must look at this from an overall spectrum analysis, because they're engendering this rage, this confusion on people, and that's just the outward manifestation. There's no telling the kind of internal mind control, internal entity subversion, if you will, that's gone on with these people, right? These social justice warriors, these Antifa activists, because they fit not only a psychological profile, but always remember, psychology follows neurology, which follows genetics every time. So it's not just that these are just, basically losers that, they're disaffected, and now they've been empowered and they have a get out of jail free card. They can do whatever they want. They can give vent to their most base impulsive instincts. Tip there, because the way that the promotion of these base impulsive instincts work as perpetrated by these entities and these human entity infested mind controllers, what they do is they bring out the worst, most base, corruptive, degenerate elements, violent, sexual, perverse, nihilistic tendencies within people. Okay, but the basis, the genetic template was there to begin with. Not only the psychological profile, but the genetic profile. Okay, these people were profiled to begin with. You wanted to make a point, Patricia?
When I do that, that just means I'm going to ask a question, but I don't want to interrupt you, so I'll do like that.
Oh, no, yeah, I just, and I don't want to belabor the point, but,
No.
but I want to just make it understood that, okay, what I'm talking about at the outset about the astral dreamscape sexual programming, that is just a small example of a much wider pattern, a much wider problem with many overlays, many tiers of programming on top of it.
What I wanted to ask a question about when you were sharing that, because it was really interesting to me when you were talking about how you're affected in your dream state. So in that, when that's taken place, is the agenda at that point to mind control, or is it creating an addiction? That's where I wanted to get clarification. Like, so are we becoming addicted to that experience when it takes place, or is it a mind controlled thing to where we're not even aware that it's a mind control, or is it both?
It's both. It's two sides of the same coin,
Okay.
Patricia. Two sides of the same coin. Yeah, I got to get my cliches straight, because addictive behavior is fostered, it's engendered, it's promoted by this mind control, right? And so this is why a lot of males that are subjected to ET, interdimensional sexual programming, if they don't become a sex addict, if they don't have partners or multiple partners, maybe they have such low self-worth that they don't see themselves as a player, as someone who can go out and, you know, interact socially and pick up on women, to use an old term. You know, the fallback option is, you know, resorting to porn, resorting to, you know, porn. The availability of porn now is just through the roof compared to what it was in the old days. So that will engender sexual addictions. And then what happens is the neural pathways in the brain, they're basically, you know, they're rewired, so to speak. They're all like rewired back to the R complex lizard part of the brain, embedded because of the addictive nature to porn. And males, this is why porn and video games working in tandem, especially violent video games, have had such a catastrophic impact on males in general, young males all the way to up to males in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, because we're so visually oriented. It's so easy to manipulate us and have these recurring sorts of types of imagery. Like, for example, if you watch some of the TV commercials on Fox and other TV channels, and I remember they were doing this with some of the shows back in the 90s and early 2000s, especially in the wake of 9/11, you would see in, say, a 30, 40 second commercial for a TV show, all these different types of like deeply symbolic images of violence, of sex, of action, of things like that, all strung together, one after the other, with no context. Like 1 minute there's a car chase, one moment rather, a car chase, a shootout scene. Next, it's a scene of a couple kissing. Next is a scene of a woman undressing. Next, it's a scene of a violent car chase. And so what they're doing is they're embedding us gradually into that, what the military actually calls, military psychologists call the lizard part of our brain. Go figure, right? Yeah. Special forces talk about the lizard part of the brain. In a lot of the training, they get people into that beast lizard part of the brain where they make them scream at the top of their lungs. In the British Parachute Regiment, in training, they have what they call milling, where they have two parachute recruits stand there with a big circle, a crowd of paratroopers around them, and they just beat the crap out of each other for 3 minutes. I don't even think they use boxing gloves. It's called milling because what they do is just bash each other for 3 minutes. And if one of them quits, or one of them backs off, or one of them stops pummeling the other guy because the other guy is just too weak or whatever, that's a penalty. They start over, and they're being encouraged and screamed at by all the paratroopers around them. It's a tradition in the British Parachute Regiment. It's called milling, but it's meant to get them in that R complex lizard part of the brain where they promote aggression. Now, if they're doing that on the surface level, imagine these beings with an interdimensional capability. Not only that, but also working through the entity, the people they're hosting in these mind control projects, or in these think tanks, or in the media. So the imagery and the messages are repeated, reinforced, and hammered at all levels of society by the academic community, by the media, by by cinema, especially Hollywood is really bad for this. So I'm just going from this the specific to the general. Okay, let me talk about another being that is type of being that's very deeply involved in this kind of thing.
Before you do, let me ask you this. When it comes to the reptilians, when you're talking about the reptilian brain, I've heard it said that all of us have a portion of our brains that are reptilian. And I wanted to ask you if that was true. And then also I wanted to ask you, before you go on to another race, where do the reptilians come from?
Well, basically, they come from three different places. If we want to look at it from a standpoint of like a place or a space,
Mm-hmm.
some of them are literally extraterrestrials. They come here from other worlds. Others are subterranean. They've been here basically all along. They live in the big, deep cavern systems underground. And some of the races, because they're not all one race, but some of the reptilian races underground have built for themselves quite elaborate installations. They kind of make it match the interior design, if you will, of the cavern systems, but they've made it very functional to support their varied activities down there. And some rely more on technology than others. Some are very, I don't know if the word primitive is apt in this case, but some reptilian races underground don't need installations. They just kind of live in the tunnel systems, and others are what you would call interdimensional, where they're usually residing in what David Icke and others would call the lower fourth dimension, which now, and which I've pointed out in some of my commentaries, the third dimension is kind of merged with the fourth dimension because of all the lunacy and insanity that's being foisted upon us as being normal, and we better accept it, right? And like I've said in my recent commentaries, now there's hate crime laws and there's laws being put in place where if you don't call a transgender by a pronoun that he or she demands to be called, then you could be in trouble. You could face jail time. You can face a hefty fine because you're not calling that person by their preferred pronoun, he, she, whatever the case may be. So that's an example of the third dimension being forcefully merged with this fourth dimension, right? And we see this all across the board, the immigrant rape invasion. So many of those types that are going around in these immigrant rape invasions, they themselves are entity infested. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. If one is so lacking in impulse control that they see a female, whether it's a young girl or it's an older woman, and they just attack them, okay, that's not human behavior, folks. That's entity infested behavior, right? And I just had Jerry Marzinski on my show, a guy with 35 years of mental health experience working with psychotic schizophrenic patients in the largest state asylum in the world in Georgia. And then after that, he became persona non grata because he kept asking the patients about the voices in their heads. Eventually, they downsized that large asylum out of existence, and then he wound up getting a job in the prison system in Arizona, where he again was working with psychotic patients. And he found out independently what myself and some of my colleagues found out also, that the voices that schizophrenics hear are really entities, because the commonality that these voices have is that everything they say reinforces the negative. Everything they say has everything to do with chipping away at the person's self-worth, chipping away at their self-esteem to the point where they have just no self-worth, no self-esteem. And then that's not even good enough. They want the person, through this reinforcing echo chamber of the OCD thought loops, to not only eventually harm themselves through substance abuse, self-sabotage, or one form or another, but in some extreme cases, it's not even very rare, they manipulate people, these voices, which are really entities, to harm others, right? And the meth, amphetamine, the crank aspect, which once again my mentor Barbara Bartley pioneered the research into this, that plays a role in this too, because meth has a sympathetic resonance. When people get on meth, they develop a sympathetic resonance precisely to these lower fourth dimensional, interdimensional entities, and it allows these entities to interface with them more easily. Okay, so getting back to your question, there's three basic kinds of reptilians. There's the outer space ones that come here, the underground ones that have been here basically all along, and the interdimensional ones, but they are not mutually exclusive. Some of these ones that came here from outer space have set bases up underground countless millennia ago, and they themselves are interdimensional, where they can alter their density, right? A lot of these beings can alter their density. That's one of the problems the human race has had to deal with all this time. A good book to read is The Andreessen Affair, The Andreessen Affair 2, The Watchers 2, because in that book, it talks about a particular group of ETs that have the ability, that manifest this ability to move through solid objects, to alter their density, et cetera, et cetera. So Yeah, that's basically what the reptilians are in a nutshell. Also, the Draco, they're the winged reptilians. They seem to have some status, some high rank in the hierarchy in the reptilian scheme of things. And the white Draco in particular, that's a whole nother story. Okay, so, and just to kind of wrap things up from the reptilian side of things, due to this long-term process of genetic hybridization, they've managed to create this it's not even a subpopulation now, because you made the point earlier about how we have this R complex brain. The oldest part of our brain is called the reptilian brain, and all the newer parts of the brain sit on top of the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain sits atop the brainstem. So literally, it's the first part of the brain that's formed, basically, but it's got all the reptilian characteristics and traits emanate from there. So, and this programming at all levels reinforces, it promotes those reptilian, if you will, characteristics within people. Okay, and the mantis beings. The mantis beings are also major players in there, in this, because like the reptilians, they have the ability to work in more than one dimension. Like the reptilians, they have the ability to utilize technology. The mantis beings are the technologists supreme in the ET interdimensional scheme of things. And what some of them do is they've set up what we would call installations, bases, and these bases, these installations are really in another dimension, but they've got technology which interfaces with our own. So they set up all these bases in a high, either a higher or lower dimension, and then they have these devices, which to a mystic or a seer who's seen them, and maybe it's the way that our mind, our soul interprets imagery, make it understandable for us. But what they describe, some of these mystics and seers and remote viewers, is these mantis beings have this technology which has like hoses or tendrils that kind of plug into our reality. They kind of, hang down, if you will, and they kind of plug into our lower dimension. And through these hoses, through these tendrils, they not only can affect us in a variety of ways, but the resulting miasma of mostly negative emotions, and also perverse emotions and aggression, sexual aggression, confusion, rage, etc., with these hoses and these tendrils, they suck up that what's been described as loosh, right? If your listeners are familiar with the classic Robert Monroe books, I think he was one of the first ones, or if I'm not mistaken, that talked about how we humans exude energy which is absorbed by these negative beings, because it's all about energetic harvesting. It's all about emotional harvesting, and it behooves these entities, because they're essentially parasitic in nature, to keep us in a low vibratory ebb. That's why there's no such thing as a good news channel. If there's good news at all, it's vapid, empty-headed, Kardashian type stuff. It's all this stuff is going on all over the world, and they like to keep us in a state of confusion, keep us in a state of like disruption. So one moment they're talking about potential war with North Korea, potential all-out nuclear war with this, that, or the other country. The next, they shift to some empty, kind of vapid, empty-headed subject matter, right? That's just how they roll. But, there's a method to that madness, because they want to keep us in the state of permanent confusion and, alternating, teetering between fear and vapid, meaningless stuff, because that way, we're just caught in a constant state of like a ping pong. Did you want to make a comment, Patricia?
Oh, now I'm scratching my nose.
Oh, like I know the feeling. And so the thing about the mantis beings is, and the reptilians and the Draco do this as well, is they augment all this manipulation, whether it's astral dreamscape manipulation, whether it's interdimensional manipulation through their machines, technology, hoses, whatever the case may be, and they perpetrate medical intrusions, if you will, upon the people. So let's say the reptilians and or the mantis beings, because oftentimes they work together, they will change in some cases they will change the person, the abductee, inside out. They will just start imbuing more and more reptilian or mantis DNA, more characteristics within the person, changing them literally from the inside out. I've known people that have had, if not nightly experiences, 2-3 times a week easily, and they're constantly waking up with marks, constantly reporting surgical procedures done on them, and they're just constantly, and it's not just harvesting of ovum or harvesting of sperm or genetic material. They're doing something else to them. They're changing them inside out. They're changing their behaviors. They're changing their psychology, right? Making these people that they're doing this to more compatible, easier to work through, easier to interface with, right? Because they see each one of us potentially as an operational asset, someone they can work through. I guarantee you, even at the local council level, and then working way up the state legislatures, all the way up to the federal level, so many of those people are entity infested. So many of those people have got attachments and energetic cords and physical and energetic implants all throughout their body, all throughout their different energy systems. That's just how they roll, because they want everyone to be under their control, to basically create their agenda, make it manifest in our physical realm.
Okay, thank you. When you brought that up, there was something that I wanted to ask, and I've been thinking about this while you were speaking, is, there's a lot of talk about shape-shifting, and that our governments are reptilians and hybrids and clones and things of that nature. So when you're saying that they're entity infested, my question is, are they actual reptilians, or are they influenced by the reptilians or the mantis? And you also answered something that I was curious about as well, is I wondered if these beings were in competition with one another, or if they work together. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll answer that last one first. Some of them are in competition together. Some of them are in conflict with one another. Some of them kind of go along to get along. I believe some of the gray factions really, some of them anyway, operate in a reptilian sphere of influence, a mantis sphere of influence. They may be on the side trying to carve out their own little niche. Okay, well, while we're working for the reps or whoever, we're going to scrape up our own DNA. We're going to scrape up our own ovum from X number of people, and we're going to have our own little hybridization program going on. What I find noteworthy, that, and I'm not saying this in an elitist sense, that one abductee, one contactee is any more elevated or important than another, but I'm only talking from what we've learned from the reptilian mantis scheme of things, that there are certain alien abductees, contactees, that they don't want the Greys to mess with these people. If the Greys mess with them at all, it's unsanctioned. It's as a group that these reps and mantis beings have no control over, because there are times when certain abductees will only be medically worked on by the reptilians, by the mantis beings, with nary a gray in sight. They don't want any underlings around. They have a supreme interest in certain people, and they're so interested in these people, and they regard these people as such important assets, if you will, that it's all close old information. It's just the reps, the Draco, and the mantis beings that are around, and that's it. You don't see any underlings, any hybridized or different little ETs running around doing the medical work. They don't want no one else around. So that's an important point. And what was the first question you asked?
I wanted to know when it came to.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
I remember now.
Okay.
Again, it's both, because due to this long-term hybridization program, they've established all these family trees going back down through the ages, the divine right of kings to rule. In the Japanese scheme of things, it's Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess, and the Japanese royal family claim descendancy from her, right? And then you have the Norse gods and the Greek gods, and et cetera, et cetera. And so what they've done is they've imbued their genetics into these subpopulations, and then they've manipulated things to ensure that these bloodlines attain positions of power. And you go back in time, right? And your listeners, if you have an opportunity, you can find this on Netflix. Go watch The White Queen, and I think that the white color is very symbolic of the white Draco. Watch The White Queen and watch the show after that, the series after that, The White Princess, because it's about the War of the Roses, the Yorks, the Lancasters, the Tudors, and it's just an example. And there are many such examples in our human history where it was always about begetting an heir to continue the dynasty, right? It was always about maintaining the purity of a certain bloodline, even if it meant marrying off one's sons or daughters to cousins, or marrying them off to other royal families in France, or whatever the case may be. They're forming all these dynastic alliances, keeping the bloodline within a certain demographic. They're not letting commoners in. Every once in a while, a commoner, if you will, slips through the cracks, but it's questionable if that commoner, in our example, gets in there by accident. There are no accidents, because there's something about that commoner's genetic DNA profile that made them suitable for, being part of this dynastic family, right? So it's all about bloodlines, and that's why, fast forward to today, you look at these, the Bush family, and you look at some of these other reptilian hybridized families. They all have a certain look to them. Nobody can tell me that Prince Philip, okay, that he looks normal. Okay, that guy, if that guy's not a reptilian hybrid, there are no reptilian hybrids, okay? And then when you look at what is known of the behavior of these so-called elite, and not just the royals, but like people in high finance, people in industry, all the way down to the state and local level, these placemen and in the corporations and in these foundations and whatnot, so many of them indulge in reptile behaviors of all kinds of crime, felonies, child abuse, et cetera, et cetera. It's genetically encoded, ingrained into their genetic profile to behave in this way, right? Now humans, when a child comes into the family, humans nurture the child, they love on the child, they provide a safe haven for the child, which is becoming increasingly difficult around the world because of the malign influence of this reptilian controlled medical system, right, if you want to call it that, which really just sickens people and is all part and parcel of this depopulation agenda. But you look at in these reptilian hybrid families, how do they greet their newborns? Oh, they abuse them, they do this to them, and they do horrific things to them. It's a completely different dynamic, right? So when people look at them and they say, and I'm talking about these hybridized reptilian Draco family bloodlines, they may look human, but if you know what to look for, you can tell right away that they've got these reptilian Draco hybrid characteristics to them. And also by their behavior, by their fruits ye shall know them, right? The things they do, the constant promotion of war, of divide and conquer, of pitting the lower classes against each other, which is what kings and queens and monarchies have done all along, right? Now they have all these foundations, they have all this big money to throw around to hire all these entity-infested young people that fit a genetic psychological profile, no different than the old Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, right? No different than the Soviet-era agitation propaganda, except now they're going after statues, now they're going after anyone who votes for Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. It's all the same, really. But by their fruits you shall know them. Instead of promoting, generating goodwill, harmony, commerce, real commerce, not cartels, not monopolies, right? And promoting things that protect and enhance nature, everything is bass backwards opposite, okay? Bass backwards is a level of stupidity and evil above ass backwards, okay? And so everything that we see is anti-life. Everything we see is anti-planet, not just anti-human, but anti all forms of life forms on this planet. The marine life, animal life on the land masses, everything is geared up towards death. It's a cult of death. It's a worshiping form of death, right? Is what it is. And pardon my bad English. And we see extreme examples of this, which is quite widespread, of, you know, these evil, wicked ceremonies that the so-called elite get into, right? So, you know, they're just not like us. They may look superficially like us, but they're not like us because they're parasites. And it doesn't behoove them to create an atmosphere where, you know, we're all uplifted and we're all feeling inner joy, serenity, harmony. We don't have to eke out a subsistence living. We don't have to trade hours for dollars and, you know, wonder how we're going to make ends meet week after week after week. Imagine the amount of loosh that's being spewed out from just your average family that's just struggling to make ends meet. Not make it to the end of the month, make it to the end of the week, and then multiply that by all the other families all over the world, right? And you can imagine the kind of miasma of suffering, pain, negative emotions that's being spewed out. And so that's what we're dealing here with. And so I want to emphasize that it's important that we create our own little bubble of happiness, of contentment and joy. And what I'm seeing now, just to digress for a moment, what I'm seeing now, because these energies are in such like a flux state, and energies spiking through the roof, and parallel to that, you have this densifying effect of all these people because of the processed food they eat, because they're eating like dead matter all the time and whatnot. They're densifying themselves. They're watching the lobotomizing TV. They're watching lobotomizing TV shows, lobotomizing movies, and they're densifying themselves. And so what's happening is it's giving these entities more and more opportunity to work through them because they're simultaneously densified, but they're too much in their headspace, right? And so that's just like a happy hunting ground for these negative entities to instill all these thought loops, instill all these negative voices, right? To encourage them to do all these different things. So, you know, it's important that we know that all this is calculated, all this is orchestrated. And getting back to the point about the Mantis beings, they're technicians, technologists par excellence, and they're also deeply involved in the genetic game, genetic manipulation. So yes, a lot of these people are reptilian hybrids. A lot of these people literally are reptilian shapeshifters, right? But I want to demystify the whole concept of shapeshifting, right?
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, because reptilians are not the only ones that shapeshift. One of my dearest friends, I saw her shapeshift into a lioness, a feline, being right in front of me, right? And, you know, I'm not scared of her. I'm not going to go, whoa, you know, she shapeshifted into a female lion, right? Because I think that's pretty cool, right? And really, it depends also on the genetic profile of the individual. Some people, there's certain types of psychics that can see the entities overshadowing the host human. And so it's important for people to understand that not only reptilians and Dracos take up people as hosts, because that person has this preponderance of reptilian or Draco DNA and, you know, follow through the bloodlines, all the endless manipulation of that particular family tree. But depending on the genetic profile, a psychic can look at somebody and they'll see a mantis being, oh, this person is taken up as a host by a mantid, right? Or a gray, or some other entity, right? I've known of cases where friends of mine in a group of people were suddenly overshadowed by what seemed to be like a tall Pleiadian Nordic looking being. Everyone was aghast, freaking out. And my friend kind of went into a trance state, right? He didn't really know what was going on, but afterwards he was told this blonde-haired space being, you know, Nordic-looking guy started talking to you, your voice changed and everything. Well, it just means that that particular race had imbued enough of their genetics, and chances are, because these things are not accidents, they don't operate in a vacuum, chances are that particular individual in our example had lifetimes, more than one or more lifetimes with that particular Nordic Pleiadian-looking race, wherever they're from in this cosmos or in the multiverse, right? Because you know, Alex Collier points out again and again, we are the product of 22 or more different ET species. So someone may not have just reptilian DNA, an overabundance of reptilian DNA. They can have the DNA profile of a number of other ET races. And so sometimes these abductees, contactees, call them what you will, they find themselves in this tug of war where they're being messed with by one group of negative parasitical entities who are trying to promote these service to self tendencies within the person, aggression, sexual, aggression, perversity, manipulation, deceitfulness, and we see so much of this. To complete the point I made earlier about these energies and the densifying going on when there's so many people, I've never known a time in this field when so many people, Patricia, were just going off the rails. Even people that I thought would never go off the rails. People that, okay, maybe they have some kind of, hang-ups, issues, whatnot. I'm not here to judge, right?
Yeah.
But they've become extreme over time, more egotistical, more service to self, more manipulative,
Yeah.
more deceptive, more into the mudslinging and the gossiping and the rumor mongering, right?
Yes.
So those are people that are on the one hand, they're passing themselves off as like light workers, as battling the forces of evil and, standing in the gap and being a light worker, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you have these people that were service to self to begin with. These are people that are thoroughly entity infested, thoroughly manipulative, thoroughly playing the victim card every chance they have. And now they're just shooting for all the marbles. They're just going crazy. They're just going nuts. And there's this group out there, this clique of people in the field. I'm not going to mention them. And those of you that are in the field, you've probably come across them. What they like doing is, on the one hand, they like to cyber stalk and cyber bully people who have a differing opinion to them, right? And it could be something trivial or insignificant. If someone says something on Facebook on a thread or says something in the comment section of a YouTube that I don't agree with, I just brush it off. But these people, they get triggered.
Yeah.
That within let me phrase that. I don't want to speak in absolutes, but within many unhealed people and frankly, many entity infested people, there's a bully just waiting to come out, right? So like when I see a comment and I don't agree with it, I just, turn the page. It doesn't mean anything to me. But what these cyber stalkers and cyber bullies who pretend to be of the light, who pretend to be working for the common good, to throw off the shackles of the Draco Empire, the Orion Empire, et cetera, man, the moment they see anyone say anything which they don't like for whatever reason, right or wrong, it doesn't matter, they're just onto that person, bullying them, private messaging them, haranguing them. And these are supposed to be the good guys also, right?
Yeah,
And
I feel like that. I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's one of the things with the interview in process that I'm doing, is that I'm talking to people that have all different types of perspectives, and I respect and honor each person that's sharing. And if I don't agree with something, there's no desire in me to go on into a war or battle zone
yes.
and create division. It's about taking away what I can from the message that's being shared. It's not about shaming and blaming and making accusations. So yeah, I feel like that it's extremely aggressive right now and very divisive, and I see nothing that is healthy or that is positive for humanity, and name calling or trying to throw
name
people.
calling or on the other hand, what's happening too is a lot of name dropping. I thought that it ended with the Donald Marshall and these other types who kept name dropping me and name dropping others. Oh, James Bartley, we're mates, we're just like this, and implying that we're friends, implying that I agree 100% with all the stuff they're spewing out, which I don't, right? And so that's happening too. And those of you that are in this field, be wary of that, this name dropping thing, because some of these people that are doing this name dropping of me in particular, I do not agree with their viewpoints, and I certainly don't agree with their methods and their tactics. And I certainly don't agree with how they comport themselves in the privacy of their own ceremonies or whatever else they get up to, you know what I mean? And then they go around name dropping me like I'm their buddies and I'm 100% on board with everything they say and do. No, ain't happening, right? And so just be mindful of that, folks, because because when these entities are working through these people, and I think that people that are pathological liars, I believe that they're so entity infested because their egos are activated, and so they're constantly in their headspace. The entities working through them have pulled off what I call the interface, where they comfortably merge themselves with this individual because of the genetic profile match and because this person's of the right density, let's say. And so not only do they have these obsessive compulsive behaviors and these OCD thought loops, right?
Mhm.
But these entities are masters of putting in thoughts which make these individuals deeply mistrustful, deeply suspicious, make them spread gossip and lies, outright lies. And some of these people are pathological liars. The things that they say are just, they don't even make sense. They don't hold water, but because they're bullies, right?
Yep.
And because they gather around them other similarly unhealed, frankly, entity-infested people who have a need to say, yeah, you know what? Let's knock this person off their perch. Let's all gang up on them. Let's take up the high moral ground. We're the good guys. This person that we're gang stalking, this person that we're saying all these things about, he's the bad guy. She's the bad guy. There's so many people I know. This happens a lot to women in the field too.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, it happens a lot to women in the field. Oftentimes, it's other women that are doing this to them. Right? Go figure. Instead of being a girl's girl, instead of being supportive of one another, you know, despite, like when I interview somebody, and I know you're the same way, Patricia, it's like, I don't like interject or make a counterpoint every time I hear someone say something I don't agree with, because then it'll just turn into a contentious mudslinging match. I don't agree with this. I don't agree with that. It doesn't matter what I believe or don't believe. I'm debriefing this person, right? I want this person to feel comfortable and just put it out on the table. And
yeah, I want to know. I want to know what you've experienced. I want to know what you have to share. That's why you're here. It's not to debate you.
Yes, yes. And so, and unfortunately, and I'll get back on topic here. I just wanted
this is
to
great.
make that point.
This is. Thank you for sharing this, because
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons I respect you so much, because I do see this in you, and so I'm really appreciative of you sharing that.
Well, thank you, because see, I've got my nose to the grindstone, so to speak. I kind of tune out a lot of this stuff, and I'm not even aware of it until people bring it to my attention. You know, and I'm thankful that people care about me enough to say, "Oh, you ought to hear what this so and so is saying about you. So what so and so is doing, name dropping, all this other stuff." Because I'm kind of in my own little bubble, you know what I mean? Kind of oblivious, just doing my own thing. I don't realize all this stuff is going on until people bring it to my attention, and then I just have to say something about it. And folks, if you're in the field, just please, just ego activation. That's the first thing. One of the first thing these negative parasitic entities do is activate the ego of the person, because by doing so, it embeds those people, entangles them further into this matrix, gets them into their headspace, where it makes it so much easier to pour all these OCD thought loops of mistrust, of suspicion. In the olden times, they used to say, "Oh, this person, she be afflicted with the spirit of accusation." Because this person, in our example, she's always accusing this person, always accusing that. In the old days, quite rightly, they thought that it was some kind of spirits or entities working through that person to create a spirit of accusation. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
See, the tendency nowadays is to say all these old people in the olden days, they were just stupid and superstitious. Were they? Were they really stupid and superstitious? These old quaint sayings which you never hear anymore. Oh, what's gotten into you, right? I mean, well, where did these terms come from? Oh, she's starting to get under my skin, right? Yeah. And some of these people have that ability. Just thinking about certain people of a negative Draco vibration, I can just thinking about them, I could feel a pressure in my heart center. I shouldn't let them have that level of control over me, quite frankly. But what happens is when I think about some of these people and all the harm they're doing, playing the victim card, and they're just like a bull in a china shop. My apologies to the bulls out there, causing all these problems and all this mayhem in the field, right? And see, that's when there's entity infestation, because rather than harmoniousness, contentedness, serenity, it's the bass-ackwards opposite, right?
Yeah.
Mudslinging. I don't know how many times, now sometimes I really appreciate it, because sometimes people, tell me, "Oh, you got to be careful of this person," and I do appreciate that. But, sometimes, you and I will get somebody on our show that doesn't resonate with certain people, and then they'll get on my case about it, right? But let's see a show of hands, people. How many of you out there have listened to all or part of an interview with someone that you didn't resonate with entirely? Am I the only one? Right? Am I the only one? So
Hey,
so it's
listen,
like,
I've already been unfriended by a group of the people that you're, like not the group you're talking about, but just like a group of people because of a particular person that I interviewed. And I was like, I really approached and attacked. And I thought, how crazy is this? Like, what is the big deal? Why would it cost you a friendship or a connection? Because you're choosing to let someone share information, whether you agree with it or not.
yes,
It's so
yes,
silly and immature.
it's it is, and I'll leave it. Leave this point, and then we'll move on and talk more about these entities and the things they do. But again, folks, there is relevance to what we're talking about, because a lot of these people, they have entities working through them or manipulating them, and the matrix itself, the increasingly AI interface that's going on. Now they have access to social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and it gives them even more opportunities to create opportunities for divisiveness, acrimony, right, mudslinging, right,
Yeah.
casting suspicions on people, right, trying to besmirch people's reputation and integrity, right.
Yeah.
And you have to ask them, ask yourself, why are they going out of their way to, but anyway.
And I also, I would say I wanted to ask this too, because this is like we talk about everyone having a shadow side of themselves. You have the light and the dark within you. So when we talk about the light and the dark, and I was thinking about everything that you've been sharing, and it made me feel like, well, this dark aspect of us, that is that reptilian part
Yes,
of us, right?
absolutely it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
This is why not many people know it, but the basis for the psychological uh, testing that the corporations and the agencies give, the modern version of it, where they ask the same questions several different times, whether it's people who want to become law enforcement, people who want to join a corporation, whatever the case may be. What they're looking for, folks, is people that are basically psychopaths. They're looking for people who will claw and climb over people's back with no empathy and will get the job done. And that's who they want in these investment banks. That's who they want in the higher levels of the financial sector, and also in law enforcement, right? And the basis for those psychological exams, which countless corporations, Fortune 500 corporations use today, and countless agencies use today, was developed by a guy named Professor Henry Murray, if memory serves. Professor Henry Murray was an OSS psychiatrist during World War II. And in his private life, he was a cross-dressing sadomasochist. Go figure, right? He had personally mind-controlled Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right? Because in the 1950s, Theodore Kaczynski took part in a volunteer so-called program where people, the likes of Professor Henry Murray and others like him, were able to sink their claws into him and conduct all this mind control and behavior modification. And then, voila, he just decades down the track, he turns into the Unabomber, right? But the point of relevance is these psychological profiles where they ask the same questions over and over and over, several different times, several different ways. They're trying to identify those amongst the applicants who fit a certain psych profile, and what they're looking for is basically a narcissist, sociopath, and as far as law enforcement is concerned, a cowardly psychopath, right? That's what they want. Okay, and so now they have the means to find them. So, just keep this in mind, that everything we're talking about here has relevance. Where you have disharmony and acrimony, that's where there's entity infestation going on big time. Where there's serenity, harmony, inner contentment, inner peace, you don't have that. And okay, so let's just keep that in mind. And one last point about the way I give interviews, okay? When I give an interview, this is just me, I'm debriefing somebody. Okay, just visualize yourself in a safe house. You got the tape recorders running, and we're having served coffee, tea, breakfast, whatever the case may be. And for hours, days, and weeks, we're just getting this guy's story or this gal's story. This person could have been an agent in place. We're looking at it in surface espionage terms. Could have been an agent in place for decades. Okay, you just let them talk and talk and talk, and I don't interrupt. I don't say, oh yeah, something like that happened to me. Then I spend 15 minutes basically saying the same thing the person just said, right? Because see, that's just self-indulgence on my part. It doesn't matter that I've had the same experience or I had a similar experience. And especially if I've told the same story before, why do I need to interrupt just to make myself feel self-important and thereby cut into the time of the person I'm interviewing, right? And this happens all the time. There's all these people, self-indulgent, narcissistic people who pass themselves off as interviewers, and I can't even listen to their interviews because they're constantly interrupting. They're constantly just knocking the person off track. When you're debriefing somebody, you never interrupt because that person, and there's certain people like George Norrie, they do this all the time. They're just about to make an important point, and then suddenly out of left field, this innocuous, trivial statement comes out of the interviewer's mouth, and that person loses their train of thought. They never go back and say what they were going to say, and that moment and that thought is gone forever. All right? So, if those of you that want to do this, be podcasters, debrief them, let them talk, right? Get out of them their story with a minimal amount of interference, and that's the way to do these. It's a debriefing, folks. It's not so much an interview, right? It's a debriefing. I want them to just let it all hang out, and you take on board, the listener, what resonates with you. Leave everything else on the shelf, okay? And don't make a judgment about the people. Don't say, oh, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that. Well, what parts of the interview did you agree with? What parts of it resonated with you? Half empty, half full. Which type are you, right? So anyhow, that much being said, get off my soapbox now, right? And forgive me the self-indulgence because, you and I have been talking. There's just been so much of this lately. But anyhow, let me get back. I talked about the reptilians. I talked about the mantis beings. And one last thing about the mantis beings is their influence is pervasive. Because of this genetic manipulation, because of their ability to work at different dimensions, and they're intimately part of key players in the soul harvesting, soul recyclement process. That's what we can't forget about, folks, because if we don't dismantle this program, we're doomed to just be reharvested, recycled, re-excreted, pardon my Anunnaki, back into this world where there's going to be a patriarchal control system, there's going to be religions, there's going to be some form of control, whether corporate, religious, whatever the case may be, dynastic, monarchical, whatever the case may be, right? And the difference is when we come back next time, the world is going to be so polluted. It'll be like these predictive programming movies we keep seeing where, these clones, they don't even know they're clones. They've been frightened. Everything is fear-based. They don't want to step outside of their safe zones because they think everything out there is contaminated, right? And they find a butterfly, they're freaking out. Oh, I didn't know there were any butterflies left, right? See, what may happen is if this process continues, because I've come to the grim realization that this Saturn moon matrix, it facilitates this whole recycling, reharvesting thing. And unfortunately, because it seems it's quite likely that a very large planet was destroyed way back in ancient times, millions and millions of years ago, and which explains in part the periodic coming back, if you will, of these very large comets and very large asteroids, which tend to have a resetting aspect to it. Just when civilization gets to a certain level of enlightenment, of spirituality, suddenly whammo, whether it's a galactic superwave every 12,500 years, whatever, from the galactic core, or a very large planet, a very large comet comes through and causes all this mayhem, then it's a reset. So it seems to me that this solar system and this planet in particular, it really is a prison planet from that standpoint, where because of the Saturn moon matrix, because of this hyperdimensional interference, this recycling aspect comes to play. And I've spoken to people who remember that there were aliens and they crash landed here, or for whatever reason they were left and abandoned here or something, and then they got caught up in the recyclement and they start coming back as a human. Like if their ship didn't crash, maybe if they just went on their merry way, they wouldn't have been stuck here. Okay, so we're talking about the ultimate disposition of what we call souls. We're talking about, okay, this is the highest stakes level we're talking about, folks, right? So Okay, so the Mantis and the Reptilians and the Greys play a key part in that soul recyclement process, right? The fake light, go to the light, all that stuff. We have to keep this in mind. And so the Mantis beings, the Reptilians, play a key role in this recyclement. What they do also when they're more evil souls, if you will, they don't go to the light, so to speak, and they don't like get punished in whatever afterlife and made to, you know, learn the folly of their ways. Oh, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. Maybe that might happen. You know, the soul or the life reflection that a lot of people in near-death experiences talk about. But the way they have of recycling souls is a lot of these really truly evil types, they'll just recycle them and put them in another body. They'll just, you know, whether it's immediate, whether it's a month, maybe it's a decade down the track or longer, they'll just bring back that soul who maybe was a king or a queen or, you know, a torturer from the Inquisition days, whatever, and they'll bring it back and they'll wind up being like the head of an intelligence agency or something. That's how they work, right? Now, as far as the Greys are concerned, the Greys, they come from different parts of the cosmos. We heard over and over again about how some of them come from Zeta Reticuli. It's a binary star system, if memory serves. But that gray shape, that gray form, is very common, it seems to me, throughout the multiverse and throughout this cosmos. And they come in different, you know, shades. They're not all gray. Some are more bluish, some are brownish, some are tannish, some are literally green. And they're not all the same, although many of them are clones, definitely clones, even within the context of their own civilization, because they lack, you know, reproductive, you know, genitalia, if you will. They can't procreate the way we do, so they're compelled to utilize genetic engineering in order to propagate and continue their race. And so maybe some of these races got their start as being a subservient genetic creation of some other race, because if you look at what's going on now in the underground bases and even on the surface, just the surface level, all these species, all these beings are being created which never, at least as far as mainstream history is concerned, mainstream zoology concerned, never existed before. Just think of all these big, aggressive, like salmon and what have you, that they're creating in these fish farms, and then they get loose and start, you know, taking over, you know,
Yeah.
the oceans, because they're big, they're aggressive, and they're kind of really, you know, primordial in their thinking. You know, they just wipe out all other competition, right? And so now, for all intents and purposes, it's just another life form that can reproduce on its own. And so some of the Greys may have started out as being subservient genetic constructs of other beings to do their bidding, to do the heavy lifting, to do the medical work, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe at some level, some of them decided, you know what? And another thing about them is many of them have this hive consciousness at work. I know that many people talk about, oh no, you know, the Greys that I meet, they have, you know, a wonderful sense of humor, and well, maybe some of them have, once you get to know them, a distinct personality. But some of them, some of the factions, some of the smaller ET Grey type races, they very much operate in a hive consciousness fashion, to the point that, you know, what some percipient abductees describe as, they'll be walking, you know, they'll get out of the car in the middle of the night, and then they'll see 3 Greys walking in lockstep towards them, right? So, you know, they're operating in a hive consciousness fashion, at least some of them. I don't speak in absolutes. I don't speak in simplistic generalizations, say they're all like this or they're not all like this. I say that there are factions of these Greys, right? And I just had Kawoni Lapsaritis come on the show. That interview will be coming out today, and he's had all kinds of Sasquatch and ET contact experiences, and he says he was healed of a severe spinal condition by these ETs that look very similar to the beings Betty Andreessen described in the Andreessen affair, the Watchers book of series, an excellent series of books. Now, those that are more skeptical and they think that all ETs are negative, they would say, well, I don't believe that. They look like a gray, but they don't really look like a classic gray, okay? At least that's not how I perceive them, and certainly not the way Kawoni perceives them. Because when one reads the Andreessen affair series of books, they call themselves the Watchers because what they do is they keep track of all the life forms on the planet, all the plants, all the flora, all the fauna and whatnot, right? And they keep samples of human genetic material, et cetera, et cetera. But they seem to be a helpful race. So I'm not going to say that all these grays, all these Zeta-looking beings are necessarily parasitic, are necessarily manipulative and harmful to the human race, because that would be an absolutist statement. There's no way I could back that up. But I would say that some of them definitely are parasitic. Some of them definitely are in it for themselves. They see us nothing more as a resource, in the same way that we have factory farming, in the same way that, we have free-range humans basically here on the surface. Some of these gray races feel the same way about us. We're just a resource for them. And they can activate the egos of all the people they're in contact with and make them feel that they're special. And, oh, no, that doesn't describe the group of grays I'm working with. Of course, they're not going to say, no, you're just, we think of you as less than a cow, right? But it goes back to ego activation, folks. So as far as the grays, the generic term, the grays and the various factions thereof, some of them definitely work within the reptilian mantis scheme of things. Some of them are basically gophers. They do a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the abductions, a lot of the medical experimentation, and they do a lot of the psychological, sexual, behavioral manipulation within the reptilian mantis scheme of things. And they're definitely a part of the meth agenda too. And they're definitely part of the pharmaceutical and the ecstasy agenda in as far as raves are concerned. Because when people take something like ecstasy, what happens is like certain pharmaceuticals and like meth, they begin to resonate in the frequency of these beings. And I've spoken to people that were shakers and movers, real big shots in the rave movements in Northern and Southern California. And they said that at some of these raves, they can see countless thousands of grays just moving in and out of people. They can see these big snake entities just hovering over a group of ravers that are dancing on the floor, and these snake entities are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as they're sucking up the loosh from all these ravers. And many people that use ecstasy, long-term ecstasy use, they develop back problems, right? And we've talked about this before, that what some of these beings, the reptilians, the grays, are known for this. They will deliberately engineer an accident or muck with someone surgically, so they wind up having excruciating lower back pain. And, the person is debilitated. They're just exuding all this loosh of despair, of hopelessness, of pain, of anguish. And that feeds these entities, right? And so the point of relevance is that some of these gray factions are working within this reptilian scheme of things. And again, the reptilians want to create, and the mantis beings want to create this miasma of negative emotions, keep all of us in a lower frequency bandwidth, whether it's through the pharmaceuticals, the media, cinema, illicit narcotics, or amphetamine use, whatever the case may be, excessive alcoholic drinking. All that keeps us in a lower vibratory state and allows these entities to run amok and perpetrate all these OCD thought loops and all these seemingly random thoughts that go through these people's minds, because they again, because of the long-term genetic manipulation, as Barbara Bartley used to say, these entities, they know us molecule by molecule, because in large part they genetically created us in a way that advances their agenda. So they don't want us, to have, all these variables working through us, where at any moment we start just resonating at a higher frequency, that we can start thinking and feeling and behaving in certain ways. They want everything. It goes back to that addiction thing, Patricia. They want everything predictable. They want a template, and you can look at the way that mass psychological programming is being exerted on the public, and you get an idea of just how pervasive and widespread this is. And then you narrow the focus down to particular individuals. Okay, we've all grown up, and some of us have had narcissistic family members. We've all had narcissistic, psychologically abusive bosses. Some people had psychologically abusive partners, et cetera, et cetera. To varying degrees, these are all people that have, these entities have genetically manipulated them, manipulated their neurology, and alter their psychology and their behavior in a way that's predictable and useful for this overall agenda of keeping us mired in this lower density, where we can't tap into these higher realms, we can't tap into these higher dimensional spiritual realms and learn eventually to break out of this. So the Zetas and others like them, they play a key role. They do a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the genetic experimentation, a lot of the abductions. They give a lot of their technology in exchange to the deep black element, military aerospace elements. I would say that the Zeta technology is not the creme de la creme of alien technology. I would say that, from a human standpoint, I remember what Bob Lazar said. He said, no, he thinks the Zeta technology is only, a few hundred years at best ahead of ours, right? And they only have that technology. Bob Lazar, made the point that because in their binary star system, there's naturally occurring elements there in the Zeta case, element 115, which they utilize as a fuel source to power their, gravity amplifiers, et cetera, et cetera. If they didn't happen to live or come from a star system that had element 115 as a naturally occurring element, they may never have developed, interstellar travel, right? And another thing about these entities is they are not stuck in this linear time treadmill the way we are. These beings, because they have these advanced capabilities and because they have this ability to alter their density and operate simultaneously in more than one dimension, they are out of this linear time trap, this flat field time effect that we're stuck in, right? I think that there's glitches in the matrix. I think that as time moves on, more and more people like that you may know, Patricia, they're starting to manifest these quantum metaphysical capabilities. They're starting to see into the future, even if it's only a week, even if it's only a month ahead of time, right? I think that more and more of that is happening as people learn to detach from this matrix, work on themselves. It's so important. I can't stress enough, folks, the importance of doing the inner shadow work. That's the hardest thing you'll ever do, right? I mean, we're so subject to triggers. We're so subject to the fluctuating nature of these energies. We just a seemingly random thought pops into our head, but is it really random, or is there some entity nearby saying, just say this thing because it'll trigger the hell out of your partner. It'll trigger the hell out of your friend, right? And that's how subtle it is, folks. We think we're just being cheeky. We think we're just being a jokester, really, but we're just saying the wrong thing at the wrong time because of the malign influence of these entities. And because the veils between worlds are thinning so much these days, unless we're very careful and mindful of our thoughts and give ourselves time to pause and really work out what we're going to say, what we're going to do next, it gives these entities inroads into manipulating us, sticking in the random thoughts, which we verbalize, which we actualize, which we manifest, because that's all they can do, right? Because we are sovereign beings. We have connection to organic source. So if we tune that out, and Jerry Marzinski and his colleague Sherry, they learned some important things with these OCD thought loops. Tell them that they're lying. Everything that they tell you is a lie. Visualize these voices with duct tape over their mouth, and at best you hear them murmuring, or sometimes that shuts off the voices entirely. Right? Tell them they're lying. Laugh at them. Right? That frustrates the hell out of them. Eventually, they'll go find easier people to manipulate. You know what I mean? So I know I'm kind of bouncing around here a little bit, but a lot of it is connected. And so I just talked about the three main groups: the Reptilians, the Draco, the Mantis, and the Greys. But there's just an endless variety of entities in between. Those are just three of the main ones.
Yeah. Now, are those the only groups that you want to talk about in this discussion?
Well, I spoke earlier about, let's see how much time we got. Oh, good. We got about a half hour or so. The beings that have been described as Andromedans, have been described as Arcturans, that have been described as Pleiadians. And not all Pleiadians are the same, folks. There's a tendency to regard in a simplistic generalization, all Pleiadians as being of the same group. From what I understand, there are even little gray-looking beings that come from the Pleiadian system, and it suggests that Pleiadians may have bioengineered some of these grays to work for them, or a faction of the Pleiadians. Okay, like for example, and I happen to believe that there's some merit in the information provided by Barbara Marciniak, and one of the reasons why I like her information, at least that which I've been exposed to, that's what I've heard, is that she's very much coming from an ass kicker mentality, right? She's not like this sugar-coating, love and light, new age la-di-da. When someone asks her a stupid question, I mean, she'll call them out, right? And she frequently talks about the Anunnaki, the Reptilians, the Draco, and these negative parasitic entities, which is in stark contrast to a lot of these people who feel that they are Pleiadian hybrid walk-ins, who are so programmed at the moment you mention anything of a negative ET interdimensional nature, they just recoil in horror. Oh, take away all that negative stuff. I don't want to hear any of that negativity. No, that's programming. For someone to have that kind of a vociferous reaction to anything that remotely smacks of negativity in the ET scheme of things, that's programming, right? And also because of the ego activation, then all the defenses kick in, and defenses and the attack mode kick in too. Well, you're just negative, like when I gave a lecture at Byron Bay, where I talked about reptilians, and I talked about the MyLab stuff. There was these new age la-di-das that wanted to form this like prayer group circle, I think, and then send me healing energy, right? Because there was all these like new agers there, these people that don't want to hear, and it's also this group of people that are into shaming those who report negative abduction experiences. I mean, they like to just gang up on people, and this, what we talked about earlier, this cyberbullying, this mob mentality, this gang mentality, and they just gang up on people when in a group setting, when they, someone has a nerve or audacity to talk about a negative, perish the thought reptilian experience. Oh, the triggering and programming kick in. So when I'm standing there talking at length about reptilians and exactly what they do to people, it triggered the hell out of some of these people, right? So, and some of these people consider themselves walk-ins. They consider themselves Arcturans. They consider themselves, highly evolved spiritual beings. Yeah, but where's the empathy? Where's the non-judgmentalism? Why the intolerance? Why the attack mode, right? See, they're not walking the walk. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. By their fruits ye shall know them, right?
Yeah.
You were going to say something, Patricia?
Well, I was just going to say that it's really, there again, that's kind of entity-based, and from what I see in people, because anytime that someone is polarized in one direction or the other, that can't be of an organic nature, their true human nature. And if you actually push the love and light too far, you'll see that dark side that they don't want to see come out of them.
The claws will come out. The claws will come out. Yeah. Like, for example, I just had, like I said, Kawoni Lapsaritis and his partner, Kelly Lapsaritis, a wonderful couple. Kawoni has had contact with 7 different types of benevolent, spiritually evolved beings, and I have no reason to doubt him. And likewise, Kelly has had encounters with, positive spiritually evolved beings, and they get information from their Sasquatch because they rightly see the Sasquatch as a distinct people. And as many of the Native American tribes, the Aboriginal people in Australia know, at least some of the Sasquatch tribes, because there's more than one, again, people fall into these simplistic generalizations, make these absolutist comments, right? Well, actually, there's a number of different Sasquatch tribes, some more psychically, spiritually evolved than others. And some of those have been here all along. They see themselves as the elder brother, elder sister of humans, and it pains them to see what's happened to this world, what humans have done to this place. But when you read, and I'm just starting to read the Sasquatch Message to Humanity, as channeled, if you want to use that term, through this the shaman guy, and the information was coming from a Sasquatch elder in a particular Sasquatch tribe, and the Sasquatch was talking about these negative ETs, talking about genetic manipulation, talking about how excuse me, these negative aliens had worked with the elements of Atlantis, and they caused all these problems. What is some of these like love and light and new agers? Are they going to go la 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 la? You're a negative Sasquatch. I don't want to hear you. You know.
Yeah.
So how does that figure in, right? So here's a Sasquatch saying, yes, there are negative beings. There are lizard people. There are ant people. There are all these different. Oh, that's another thing. The insectoids. How can I forget about them? The insectoids are, maybe some other show I'll talk more about this. But I only bring this up because you've got a very sophisticated, switched on audience that I really don't need to bring this up. But it's just to show that, if I'm so negative, why would I have Coone Lapsaritis and Kelly Lapsaritis talk about the ongoing contacts they're having with these spiritually evolved Sasquatch who frequently work with spiritually evolved ETs? And that's a subject matter that the mainstream Bigfoot Sasquatch researchers don't want to hear about. They don't want to hear about the metaphysical capabilities, the psychic abilities of Sasquatch. They don't want to know that Sasquatch works, elements of the Sasquatch community works in unison with spiritually evolved ETs. They don't want to know any of that, right? They just want to keep everything down to the footprints, the tracks, the fur, little dwellings made by Sasquatch in the woods. They want to keep it at that level, right?
Yeah, that's kind of making a joke of it in a way. It's discrediting it.
It is. It's keeping it from a UFO perspective, ET perspective, it's keeping it at the lights in the sky level, right? Yeah. So as far as the other ET races I want to talk about, there's a bewildering variety of them, but what more and more people are reporting that have second sight, if you will, this mystic seer type vision, they're starting to see this octopus-like being, right? They're starting to see, and this octopus-like being, it's been described as a big head. It's been described as a big head octopus-looking entity with big, long tendrils. And it has some kind of connection with this inorganic AI, that it has some kind of connection with the AI, and it seems to be kind of like a nerve center or a brain, if you will, of this AI. And it seems to have some influence, malign influence, in our particular solar system. Again, I'm guessing that it has something to do perhaps with this soul harvesting, soul recycling element that's going on. So I'd be interested to know if any of your listeners have seen, either in actual physical encounter or in a mystical third eye vision sense, if they've seen this big head, big octopus kind of being that seems to be able to work through technology, seems to be able to work through the internet, seems to be able to work through people. Interesting that the National Reconnaissance Office, which was only admitted, its existence was only admitted to, I think, back in '94, and only reason that came out was because of the gigantic budget they had, right? The National Reconnaissance Office, they build the satellites, and they work hand in glove with the NSA, and they're the ones that, build this constellation of satellites all over the place, not only imagery satellites, but, eavesdropping satellites to pick up communications. And the logo of the National Reconnaissance Office is like this big octopus that's like wrapping its tentacles around the planet Earth. I go, wow, that's weird, isn't it? Yeah. You know what I mean? So that's one type of race. There's another type of race, which I feel moved to talk about now. It's an amphibian race. And the amphibians seem to be friendly towards humans, at least this particular faction I'm thinking of. They've taken groups of humans to their world, which seems to be a water world, and these are kind of fish-like humanoid beings that are telepathic, and they seem to be friendly. I'm just talking about a particular faction. There may be more, of course. It's a big multiverse. And then at the bottom of the ocean, there is an advanced human race, which they wear like gowns and robes, and they appear at times to be somewhat translucent, where you could they have this diaphanous, if that's the word, kind of element to them, where you can almost see through them. And they have been down there all along. They've been down there, and they have nothing but contempt for the surface population. They want nothing to do with us. there are deep black elements of the military, in particular deep black elements of naval intelligence, and I've only talked about this very rarely, that have interacted with them. They've taken personal friends of mine, elements of naval intelligence, in what look like, they're kind of like diving bells, but they're kind of like a spherical energy, force field energy pod, if you will. And then, they put the MyLab accompanied by one or more military people, naval people, and then they take this energy ball down to the ocean floor where this race is. And I think they have a dome that protects their civilization down there, and they interact with, the people in this civilization. But I don't know, things may have changed. When I first heard about these beings, this race, back in the 90s, they were very, very suspicious of the motives, understandably, of this deep black element of naval intelligence, because, like I said earlier, they have nothing but contempt for the people on the surface, understandable. And they also know that this deep black element of the Navy has forged their own alliances with certain non-human factions. And, it's still up in the air. These deep black elements of the military, be they Air Force, Army, or Navy, just who's really in control. I would argue that at least some of these military elements are not in control. I would argue that due to the hybridization and the fact that one or more ET races and subterranean races, through this long-term genetic hybridization process, can insert key players into these deep black military groups that are their hybrids, essentially. Their reptilian hybrids, their Draco hybrids, their Mantis hybrids, right? And then they go and forge these alliances through hook or crook, one way or the other. They somehow wind up having these interactions with certain non-human elements, let's say. I question whether those groups are totally under human control as we understand it, right? Because even in the surface level and subsurface military ET interactions, like Bob Lazar talked about this, where there was an incident where these pushy military security guards, they got wiped out, a number of them, by the Zetas, some kind of energy weapon that gave all the military security people like these head wounds that killed them. And then we've heard similar stories in Dulce and other places where there's just been this conflict between elements of the deep black military and the ETs, and often as not, when we hear these stories, usually the humans come off second best. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, if that's just what we've heard in dribs and drabs coming from these deep weird science underground labs, it's questionable whether, just how much control the humans have in some of these projects. And I would suggest that at this point, at least some of these deep black military aerospace ET groups are merely proxies at this point, merely auxiliaries, if you will, of this greater Draco Orion type empire. I think that at this point, for all intents and purposes, at least some of these factions are basically working within the reptilian Draco negative alien scheme of things, because the behavior they mete out towards certain MyLabs, their secrecy, their tendency to just do things that are just reprehensible and completely off the hook as far as ethics, morality, etc. is concerned. It's all non-human in nature to me. It's all it reeks of a non-connection to organic source. So I have to question, just when people talk about this secret space program or that secret space program, they make it seem like it's the Star Trek Federation, and it's that it's all just a bunch of good guys and good aliens working together. I would say, that much being said, I would say that there are factions of what we would perceive, or in human terms, what would be regarded as good aliens, if you will, that are working against these negative ET military factions. But we also must remember that when we try to understand all of this, we tend to look at it from a lower dimensional perspective. We tend to look at it good, bad, evil, good, and these really simplistic terms when there's so many shades of gray, right? And so we have to learn to start looking at this from a higher dimensional rather perspective, and it's not all black and white. That there's shades of gray, and some of these seemingly good aliens may be doing things out of self-interest. We must always keep that in mind. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, yeah, no, you did great. You did really great. I've been trying to be quiet and not talk over you and let you share, because I feel like this is really important to the way you shared in our first discussion, and just this will create a foundation for the next as we go into deeper, subjects. And so I've appreciated everything that you've shared, and you can wrap it up however you would like.
Yeah, I will talk more about some of what seem to be more positive, benevolent ETs, spiritually evolved ETs. I know that even the benevolent, spiritually evolved ETs on occasion, and this is understandable even when looking at it from the surface level standpoint, looking back in history, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer kind of thing, because I've known people who were essentially liaisons. This one gal comes to mind. She was descended from the Habsburg monarchies, and she was interacting with reptilians of a very high order from the reptilian scheme of things. Were reptilians that have a lot of authority in and out of this dimension, and were heavily into the cloning genetic engineering game. There was the reptilian leader she perceived of that particular faction that she interacted with, and seemed to regard this gal as its mate, and then the second in command that she called him, right? And they actually created at least two bodies for this particular reptilian. They created a human body, and they created a reptilian body. And you always have to take with a grain of salt what these reptilians and other entities tell people, even if the people they're telling basically have bought the whole agenda hook, line, and sinker. I'm not saying this gal did. This gal was trying her darndest to get out from under their control. But there are people that, only want to see the good side of whatever ET group they're interacting with, and they tend to take on board everything they're told at face value, right? So we must keep in mind that even though some of these beings may seem to be positive, or there's a lot of people that are having ongoing reptilian experiences that they regard, for whatever reason, the reptilians as that they're involved with as positive, and they tend to see them as an entirely different culture with their own mores, their own ethics, et cetera, that they may not tell those people the truth, because really they have no need to. Everything in our dimension, in our plane of existence, seems to be, need to know, secrecy, right, deception, et cetera, et cetera. That much being said, what they told this gal that was descended from the Habsburgs was that they had created two bodies for the top reptilian in this particular group. One was a human body, and he looked kind of like a tall Nordic guy, go figure. And then the other body was a reptilian body, because they told her, and I've heard this from others, that this particular reptilian leader for this particular reptilian faction had not been in physical embodiment, if you will, for like 5,000 years in our time. That the last time he was kind of in physical embodiment, at least for part of the time, he was regarded as a god, a literal god in ancient India. And so all this time since then, he's been kind of in the fourth, fifth, whatever dimension he's been in. And now, because of, pressing urgency, because they're moving their agenda along, it's been decided at a very high level, according to, what this reptilian and the number two have been saying to this girl. This is, sometime in the past now, that, it's time for him to be in physical embodiment more often. Hence, they created this reptilian body and this human reptilian body. It's human in appearance, but of course, the consciousness within it will be reptilian. And the point of relevance is, she has been used as a liaison in higher dimensions where the reptilians will take her to what amounts to a parlay. Some people may have heard me talk about this, but it bears repeating because it's relevant to the point I'm making about keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And what they would do is, in these parlays, there would be factions of the Greys there. There would be reptilian factions there. There would be Pleiadian factions there, right? And I'm not going to jump to conclusions and say, oh, that means that Pleiadian group is of necessity evil because they're working with the reptilians. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is what this gal reported to me years ago was that they would use her as like an intermediary. The reptilians would say to her something, and then she would turn and telepathically translate, if you will, to the Pleiadians. Now, one would ask, well, why don't they just talk to each other, like species to species? They can do that. Well, of course they can do that. But even in that higher dimension, it gives them time, so to speak, to formulate a response. And we've even seen this in our surface level history. Okay, think of, some of your listeners may be familiar with ancient Roman history when the Roman commander Scipio met with his Carthaginian counterpart Hannibal. They worked through interpreters. Now both could speak each other's language. Hannibal spoke Latin, and as far as I know, Scipio was able to speak Punic or Carthaginian, Phoenician. But they worked through translators to give themselves time to formulate a response, right? Mm-hmm. And people are even trained in this, like Defense Language Institute in Monterey. It's basically a spy school. I've spoken to people who've gone through this. They teach them how to pick each other's brains at cocktail parties at embassies and stuff like that. There's a way to go about doing it, right? And so let's take it to an ET interdimensional level. Here's this little gal, and the Pleiadians say something to her, and then she in turn, reports it, to the reptilians who she's essentially working for. Then the reptilians, say, okay, ask the Greys this, and then, say they had this dynamic going on, and she'd done this a number of times. There does seem to be elements of the Pleiadians, whether it's a marriage of convenience, whether it's going along to get along, whether it's because through interbreeding, genetic manipulation, or whatever the case may be, somehow, some way, the reptilians were able to imbue some of their DNA, some of their consciousness, if you will, into a particular Pleiadian group. But there seems to be a Pleiadian group or groups or factions that consciously, willingly work within the reptilian scheme of things, right? But because of the ability of the reptilians to shapeshift, and they've done this many times, they appear to, and I think this is what happens to a lot of these people who fancy themselves Pleiadian hybrid walk-ins. This one gal walked up to me at a conference, and without even knowing me from Adam, she says, "I'm a Pleiadian hybrid walk-in," and I was like, gee, how do I answer that? It's like, I'm Elvis's, former manager, Colonel Tom Parker. I don't know what to say to that. You know what I mean? So I think what happens is, and I know this has happened in some cases, where the reptilians, because of their ability to shapeshift, because of the genetic manipulation of the Nordic Aryan races, if you will, think of poor Princess Diana, right? Where they needed her genetics to kind of keep her offspring, looking more human, because they're on the verge of looking more like Prince Philip, and pretty soon someone's going to catch on. They're not quite like us, right? So they have to every once in a while mix in like blonde, blue-eyed Princess Diana type genetics. So what happens is sometimes these reptilians show up, they shapeshift into a Nordic-looking being, and so they appear to the percipient as like a Nordic Pleiadian space being or beings. And I knew a guy that had a torrid 6-month love affair with what he thought was a Nordic Pleiadian space woman. Turned out, 6 months down the track, the spell had worn off, and he found out he was having sex with what we call a female yellow belly reptilian, right? Mm-hmm. All that time, he thought he was having sex with the blonde Pleiadian space woman. It was a reptilian. And they do this throughout history. You see this interwoven tapestry between the Nordic beings and the reptilians. You go back to ancient dynastic Egypt. They've done DNA tests on, I think, who was it, Ramses II. And it turned out he was type A blood, which is typical of the Scandinavian Nordic-looking people. Blonde hair, blue eyes. His mummy was preserved so well that they knew that he had blonde hair and blonde eyelashes, completely different from the native indigenous people that we come to associate as Egyptians. Yet somehow, some way, in ancient times, yeah, at least some of the pharaohs, at least some of these dynasties were ruled by these blonde Palladian Nordic-looking people, right? But then again, they wear these headdresses, like think of the Middle Kingdom, this big cobra headdress, right? You know what I mean? So on the one hand, they look kind of Nordic and Aryan, blonde-looking. On the other hand, they're wearing regalia that suggests that they have some kind of connection to the Serpent Brotherhood. So the point of relevance is that that's an example where at least one group of Pleiadians in this parlay were interacting with the Reptilians. Whether that group of Pleiadians was in cahoots with the Reptilians, maybe it's like, they're just setting boundaries. Okay, we don't mind if you, do this or that in this, that, or the other sector of the galaxy, whatever. Just kind of leave this area alone. We can live with you guys doing all this crap over here. You just kind of leave, our sphere of influence alone. I can see something like that happening. And then I could also see how some of the Pleiadian factions, and certainly some of the Lyran factions going way back when, the Lyrans were, at least some of them were these feline beings, lion beings. And it's not just lion beings. Some of them look more cheetah-like. Some of them look more cat-like. Some of them look more like lynx-like, right? But generally, the generic term felines, some of these are warrior races. And that's another thing that a lot of these love and lighters, they can't wrap their mind around because of the programming, right? That some of these benevolent aliens, if you will, they're warrior races. And some of the Pleiadians, certainly, if you listen to Barbara Marciniak, and she sounds kind of militant at times, because from what I understand, some of these Pleiadians had warred against some of the Draco, some of the Orion, some of the Reptilian factions. So there's been ongoing conflict throughout the cosmos for a long time. And now what we see is the latest installment of that's reached our little corner of the multiverse. And it's been going on for a long time in our solar system. Our solar system, I hate to say it, but because of the nature, and I'll wrap it up here, and then I'll wrap it up with some good news too, because I never want to leave people, bitter pill to have to swallow. But because of the nature of this Moon, Saturn, matrix, recycling, soul harvesting agenda, reincarnational agenda. What the negative forces have done is they've turned our planet into a dumping ground of so many spiritually unevolved, service to self type souls, so many wicked, negative entities, and that they've plugged into this reincarnational cycle, and through adroit manipulation of certain bloodlines seem to elevate them into positions of power, even if it's just at the local grassroots level of like a psychologically abusive classmate, fellow employee, a boss, whatever the case may be. In that little sphere of influence, within that little scheme of things, some people are being like psychologically oppressed, psychologically abused. We see this play out in the family and domestic scene over and over and over again with all the violence and whatnot. So, I only bring this up because, yes, it's been a dumping ground, this planet, because of the nature of the soul harvesting, recyclement, reincarnational agenda. But at the same time, and the New Agers have used this term, and it's lost a lot of its real meaning. They throw around terms like star seeds over and over again, but they're coming more from this let's not talk about anything negative program mentality. The fact of the matter is, many of your listeners do come from higher dimensional star systems. Many of you have come here to hold space, to anchor higher frequencies, stay embodied. It's the only way to anchor high frequencies, only way to pull in, maintain a connection to organic source, but also pull in higher dimensional, higher spiritual downloaded information, right? And I'm absolutely convinced that many of your listeners fall into that category. And that is very encouraging to me, because I think that at some point we may have already reached it, but if we haven't reached it yet, it's not too long in coming that a critical mass will be reached. There's going to be enough people of a certain consciousness level that and I can only speak for a certain demographic, right? And people may or may not agree with me on this. I'm not of the mindset, a Pollyanna mindset, that everyone is going to break away from this matrix of control, this harvesting soul recyclement process. But I do believe a significant number of people will have done enough inner work that they will break away from the gravitational pull of the system, and then they'll choose where they want to incarnate next. They'll choose what star system that they want to go back to, or a new star system to help create life and help terraform in a positive, benevolent way. But what's happening in our solar system is it's turned into a bottleneck in a very real way of all these souls that endlessly recycle. So what happens in the solar system, the ultimate outcome of this drama that we're all immersed in, is going to have like resounding manifold effects on not just the rest of this plane, but throughout the multiverse because of the logjam. So, count yourselves as like, you watch shows like Survivor on TV, and you're the real deal, folks. It's like, a lot of volunteers were asked for. A lot of people voluntarily signed up for this gig. Only so many were taken. So consider yourselves, not in an elitist, egotistical sense of being elite, but at some level, your oversoul and also the intelligences at many different higher levels of spiritual involvement, they saw you as having the wherewithal, the means, the mental, spiritual toughness to come here and make a difference. So, just be proud of the fact. And the thing about it is, the way it works, nobody has to really know you even do all this kind of work. Mm-hmm. It's like when and I'll leave you with this thought, when I'm around mixed company, I don't have to prove anything to any of them. They could sit there at the other end of the table and giggle about UFOs and aliens and little green men. My attitude is they don't have clearance. They don't have. So that's what they do to us. Oh, you don't have clearance, national security. They don't exist. Yada yada yada. You know what? I do the same thing. You don't have clearance. You don't have the requisite, level of consciousness to understand any of this. So you know what? I'm undercover. You don't have to know I've got a podcast. They don't have to know that I'm writing a book. They don't have to know that I give lectures. Need to know, right? I'll dumb down my conversation to a level they'll understand, right? Because at some level we all have a role to play, and we all have we project an outward facade at times. It's necessary to do so at times, right? Because the nature of this control system, you don't want to just sit there and just draw like a big target on your forehead by saying and doing things. We have to, at this point, be as much as possible slide under the radar, right? So anyhow, thank you so much, Patricia, for letting me come on here and talk at length of these subjects. I hope I answered your questions, and
oh, yes, you did, and you're welcome, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you for what you shared tonight. I think it was just excellent, and especially with the way that you closed, I feel like that was just a great and beautiful way to close.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's sincere, it's heartfelt. I really feel that, right? I'm one of those half fool guys,
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely.
All right, have a great day.
Please come on my show too when you have the chance.
I will, and I want to thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You take care.
Yeah,
bye for now.
All right, bye.